it would be up against the very powerful military security complex, which can finance opponents in political campaigns of those people trying to reduce the war. And it's hard to say who would prevail in that type of a struggle. And also, I think the CIA is committed to the wars. And it's committed to the puppet governments because its influence is everywhere. It penetrates everything. And so who knows? We may have other false flag events that make it impossible to curtail the wars because people get all enraged again. And we could have false flag events that make the politicians around Ron Paul who are trying to begin thinking about how to wind these wars down, to make them look like they're not patriotic or they're not aware of the real threat. They're not going to support the troops and the war on terror. So the game is far from over. You know, the problem, Aaron, is that those forces in the government that have these hidden agendas have gotten away with so much. They're very audacious now, and there's no end to their ability to pull off false flag events that would further their goal of continuing the wars and continuing the effort to acquire hegemony.
And it started with the murder of my brother. My brother was picked up for a so-called parole violation in Southern California, sent immediately to Oklahoma City. 2 days later, the federal government said he committed suicide, and they tried to have his body cremated. We never had a motive for why they killed him. And then shortly before he was executed, I get a message from Tim McVeigh that said, when I saw your brother's picture and heard what happened to him, I wanted you to know that he was killed by the FBI. They mistook him for Richard Lee Guthrie. And Guthrie was the person I believe is John Doe 2. Guthrie, about a year after my brother's murder, ended up supposedly hanging himself while in the custody of the FBI. And we had a witness to my brother's murder, and a month before we went to trial, they found him hanging in his cell. And I didn't start out to solve the Oklahoma City bombing. I started out to find out who killed my brother and why. But everything I did took me to Oklahoma City in the bombing. Well, I started to sue the government under the Freedom of Information Act to get records. And among the first records I got were a series of teletypes from FBI Director Louis Freeh to FBI offices in Oklahoma and around certain locations around the country, talking about McVeigh had called Elohim City 2 days before the bombing and had asked for more help. And an informant had intercepted that call and warned the FBI and advised the FBI. I had documents that showed that a government informant had actually gone to Oklahoma City with McVeigh and scouted the target 4 months before the bombing.
And McVeigh told, and he fits the MO of this, Nichols and others, and sworn affidavits now, that he was part of a black op team, basically infiltrating militias, counterterrorism, but then it shifted to they were going to do some type of drill bomb or test, and then they just basically went and then set McVeigh up, which is what they classically do, correct?
It has all the earmarks of having been a government operation, or it's not an operation, but certainly one they knew about and were on top of it almost from the beginning.
And then months later, Terrence Yakey, Cop of the Year, is being followed, calls his partner, says, I've been followed by the FBI. Then he's found in a field, tortured to death. And of course, I mean, this is who you work for, government. This is what America is. Cop killing scum. We'll be right back. Hey, what's your pension funds?
Oh, no.
Nasser was not the cause of terrorism in Egypt, but the target of it. But why would someone like Kissinger, someone whose very reputation depends upon his historical knowledge and political acumen, tell such a transparent lie? The answer is simple. When Kissinger uses the word terrorism, he is not using it as a descriptive term about acts of political violence and bloodshed. He is using the word itself as a political weapon. You see, to Kissinger and the other adherents of the globalist ideology, terrorism is simply a word for any act that threatens the agenda of the globalists. In this twisted worldview, those who believe that national autonomy is more important than the needs of international finance capital are terrorists. Those who are opposed to the free trade agreements that have offshored the manufacturing base of the first world and consigned the developing world to squalor are terrorists. Those who uphold the principle that the people are the arbiters of their own lives and that these lives should not be subject to the whims of multinational corporations are terrorists. That Nasser was so vehemently and treacherously opposed by the globalists with a vested interest in stopping a stable, secure Arab state is not surprising, nor is it by any means the only example of this phenomenon. On the contrary, the 20th century is littered with such examples. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected leader of Iran, nationalized British petroleum interests in the country. 2 years later, a CIA team led by Kermit Roosevelt, the president's grandson, provocateured, funded, and fomented a coup d'etat against Mossadegh, a coup that installed the autocratic Shah as leader and paved the way for Savak security forces to begin a reign of terror and torture. To the globalists, however, the Shah was the good guy, and Mossadegh had been the terrorist. In 1952, Jacobo Arbenz, the democratically elected leader of Guatemala, began a series of land reforms that expropriated holdings of the United Fruit Company. In 1953, the CIA began training rebels, recruiting pilots, and setting up communications to agitate a coup. The following year, Arbenz was overthrown, beginning decades of military dictatorship and civil strife. In the eyes of the globalists, though, Arbenz was the terrorist. In 1970, Salvador Allende won the Chilean elections against the US-backed and financed Jorge Alessandri. When he began nationalizing US copper firms and large industries, the US backed a coup that ended in Allende's death and the beginning of the brutal reign of General Augusto Pinochet. But in the twisted worldview of the globalists, it was not Pinochet who was the terrorist, but Allende. Numerous other examples exist, but the pattern is obvious and speaks for itself. Terrorism is a word for anything or anyone opposed to the interests of international capital. The so-called war on terror has never been about stopping a bunch of Islamic fundamentalists. If the US had wanted that, they would have supported Nasser, not undermined him. They would have encouraged Mossadegh, not overthrown him. If the US had been scared of the scourge of radical Islam, they would not have funded it in Afghanistan in the 1980s. They would not have protected and fostered and funded Mohammed Junaid Babar and Harun Rashid Aswat and Luay al-Saka and Khalid al-Maidhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi and Anwar al-Awlaki and all of the other patsies, stooges, informants, and operatives that have been paraded in front of the cameras just long enough to identify them as the faces of evil, but never long enough for anyone to actually investigate their backgrounds. Because in each and every case, the big, fabulous terror plots always tie back to the US British-Israeli intelligence complex and its tentacles around the world. No, terrorism is only tangentially related to these radical Muslims, and only insofar as they are funded, trained, and enabled by their terrorist overlords in the corridors of Langley, Virginia. Proof of this simple truth has been amply provided time and again since the inception of this mythical war on terror. In the wake of mass popular protest against the globalist agenda in Seattle in '99, in Washington and Montreal in 2000, and in Genoa in 2001, the global power elite were desperate for a way to defuse and derail their opposition. In the wake of 9/11, they had their chance. Italian plutocrat and globalist stooge Silvio Berlusconi wasted no time in attempting to use the event to blame the anti-globalization movement. There was a singular coincidence between this action and the anti-globalization movement that has manifested itself for a year now, he said at the time. Other arms and organs of the elite power structure have been no less strident, if somewhat more subtle, in using the terror paradigm to stigmatize any and all opposition to their agenda. In 2005, the RAND Corporation released a report on homegrown terror threats in which they identified the terror threat not as one of radicalized Muslims driven by religious fervor, but protesters and activists driven by opposition to the ideals of the globalists. developing imperatives stemming from anti-globalization do appear to be providing a radical domestic context for galvanizing the militancy of both the far right as well as those driven by more specific extremist environmental agendas. Since then, the entire process of demonizing political opponents through the use of the word weapon terrorist has descended into the most absurd form of political farce, with a flurry of reports from the Missouri Information Analysis Center to the state government of Virginia to the Texas Department of Public Safety claiming increasingly ridiculous indicators of terrorism, from buying baby formula to wearing blue jeans to carrying a driver's license. All of this terror hysteria that the public has been force-fed over the past decade would be utterly incomprehensible if we were to understand terrorist to mean what you and I and John Q. Public believe it means. But it does not. You see, in our modern world, terrorism is not terrorism. It does not describe a tactic. It is not about violence and bloodshed, suicide bombers, or Allah Akbar. It is not a word. It is a weapon. A weapon aimed at those who disagree with the aims of Heinz Kissinger and all of his Bilderberg CFR trilateralist ilk. Those who wish for the supremacy of a small, rich elite of financiers and multinational monopoly capital thugs. Terrorism is not a word, not a concept. It is a weapon that is aimed at you and me. And that, in the final equation, is our opportunity. We can point out that terrorism is a word, and it does describe the actions of the bloodthirsty elite who kill and maim the innocent, who start wars, or overthrow governments, or incite violence to achieve their aims. And in that simple action, the reclaiming of the word terrorism to identify the globalist kingpins who have been puppeteering international politics for generation after generation, we can disarm Kissinger and all the other pimps of the war on terror hysteria. For the Corbett Report in Western Japan, I am James Corbett.
Now do you believe? What did you want? What are you doing here?
Kill the Cleons! It's never us, isn't it?
Done!
When the lieutenant became unconscious, the alien lost energy.
It subsists on the emotions of others.
This one appears to be strengthened by mental radiations of hostility, violent intentions.
It exists on the hate of others.
To put it simply. And it has acted as a catalyst, creating this situation. In order to satisfy that need, it has brought together opposing forces in an effort to promote the most violent mode of conflict.
We've got to get rid of it.
And all hostile attitudes on board must be eliminated. The fighting must end, and soon.
Oh, we're a doom ship. We've got to pool our knowledge.
We must
Find a way to defeat the alien force of hate. Stop the war now or spend eternity in futile, bloody violence.
It has to stop.
Look, gang, for the rest of our lives. 1,000 lifetimes. Senseless violence. Fighting. While an alien has total control over us. And it goes on and on. The good old game of war, pawn against pawn. Stopping the bad guy.